The Great Gatsby is a 1925 tragedy novel written by Francis Scott Fitzgerald. The story revolves around rich young people living on Long Island in 1922. In this context, a not-so-rich young man named Nick Carraway moves to Long Island and forms a friendship with a peculiar and eccentric guy named J. Gatsby. Jay has a friendly but also extremely enigmatic behavior. His luxurious and gigantic parties seem to be a facade for some hidden secret. Little by little, Nick discovers an old romance between Jay Gatsby and Daisy Buchanan, a resident at the region and also Nick's distant cousin. Side by side with the story, there's a very interesting amount of symbology in the book, ranging from a more overt degree to a more subtle one. I'll deal with these symbologies through separate events that I'll distribute in steps to facilitate the explanation. Since the beginning of the book, it's clear how Tom Buchanan represents the rich who only takes advantage of the poorer classes, without even thinking about respecting them. This becomes clear through his affair with the wife of the mechanic, Mr. Wilson, who represents the poorer classes, which means the rich man is abusing the poor man's wife for the simple fact of being rich. Although recurring, the contrast between rich and poor is only the thinnest layer of the book. Many reveals tend to emphasize this contrast as if the story was based on an immense war between classes, but this is not true. In fact, this is the poorest analysis that can be extracted from the story, and this explains why I am discussing it only as the first step. At the end of the book, Gatsby's funeral features just a few people, and one of them is a minister, who is only there out of obligation. In other words, the funeral shows how the accumulation of earthly treasures is simply futile. Parties, drinks, mansions, cars. All of this is purely temporary. For a filth-rich person, this type of material ostentation serves to highlight their status and consequently adapt to their social relations, just as Jay Gatsby does. Despite having crowded parties and pats on the back from great friends, Gatsby's life is empty, dark, and melancholic. His only friend is the protagonist, Nick Carraway, who Gatsby doesn't even see as a friend. After all, the definition of friend is too vague for him. Deep down, Gatsby sees Nick as a bridge to his beloved Daisy, a kind of necessary obstacle. Actually, there is no difference between Gatsby's funeral and his parties. In both events, Gatsby is alone. The contrast that Nick Carraway causes in each interaction with the genuinely rich is a way of inserting us into the tale, as if the protagonists were our guides into that world. He mocks their way of life, feels out of place, tries to find himself, and still ends up thrown aside by the beautiful and vain Jordan Baker. When we see Nick and Gatsby together, it's almost like seeing water and fire. While Nick is clear, simple, and honest, Gatsby is dark, superb, and terribly mysterious. A mystery is maintained throughout the book about Gatsby's fortune, leaving the reader curious about how the tycoon achieved such social status. It turns out, however, that this entire status is merely superficial, as previously stated. Gatsby is lonely and sad. Parties and champagne cannot fill the void of not having the grace of a lady by his side. In this case, the love of Daisy Buchanan. Nick lives this implicit throughout the book, always narrating Gatsby's eccentric and at times bizarre behavior. One night, Nick sees Gatsby for the first time in the garden of his mansion. Gatsby was standing in front of a pier as he looked at the horizon and extended his hand towards a green light lost among the waters. That light was emitted from the house of Daisy Buchanan, the love of his life. The scene takes place at night, which denotes that such light symbolically is nothing more than Gatsby's dream, which is to possess Daisy. Soon after, he leaves the scene, entering his mansion. Just like in a dream, this event occurs shortly before we wake up and see that everything was just imagination, symbolically representing Gatsby's idealization of a life he will never have. In fact, Nick himself questioned what he really saw. At one point, Tom Buchanan searched for his lover, Mr. Wilson's wife, in the Valley of Ashes, which is actually written with first capital letters, just like a name. What else would that mean but complete perdition? The betrayal that culminates in two families destroyed, both rich and poor. The story is telling us that sin affects everyone. Just like in the Bible, the valley here also represents a place of suffering, sadness, loneliness, and above all, no escape. It is where the weak find their refuge. You who enter abandon all hope, as it is written on the gates of hell in Dante's Divine Comedy. Returning to the story, although he's strong physically, Tom is very weak psychologically, falling into all the temptations of fate and alternating his usual state of manipulator to an explosive and disrespectful person. In other words, physical strength is worthless when commanded by a broken spirit. Another fundamental piece to understand the tale is on the route between the rich people's residences and the Valley of Ashes. There is a huge billboard containing an advertisement for an optician called Dr. Eckelberg, which is visible to everyone who crosses the road. Nick describes the eyes drawn on the billboard as eyes that do not emerge from any face, but from behind a pair of enormous yellow glasses resting on a non-existent nose. Nick says it's just an advertisement for a smart optician, but I believe it's much more than that. Right at the beginning of the story, Nick bumps into a guy who wears glasses in the library of Gatsby's mansion, where no one else goes. Curious, right? This guy says that all the books there are true, and then, without us knowing who this character is, he just disappears. At the end of the story, at Jay Gatsby's funeral, in addition to the ceremony's minister and Nick Carraway, the same man with glasses appears again. Along with Nick, he is the only one who is with Gatsby in his final moment, without even being invited. I'm quite sure that this character is Dr. Eckelberg himself, who symbolically represents God. Although we don't realize it at first glance, the eyes of God have always been there, watching over everyone, symbolized through the eyes that were on that billboard. Following every vehicle that crosses the road, goes to parties, and then returns home. He was in Gatsby's house, but not in the ballroom with the others, but in the library, the most private place in a house. Books reflect the personality of their owner and basically contain their essence. There was God at the library, seeing the truth about Gatsby. God was also at the funeral, upset that Gatsby himself was never able to see the truth about his life. In fact, Gatsby reduced his existence to a world of appearances, futility, and disguised sadness. In other words, Gatsby preferred a world of lies. The Great Gatsby is one of the best books of the 20th century, but is often seen as just a portrait of the perverted youth of the jazz age. In fact, the book has much more to offer than this. It's a soap opera about loneliness, love, materialism, and superficiality. Basically, Francis Scott Fitzgerald is telling you not to waste your life trying to impress the others. Oh, I almost forgot. This film sucks.